Since I'm using the microphone handheld, I'm going to use this stand, and then hopefully I'll remember to get it back to Elena. I want to think about this verse from the Gospel of Luke first and tell you a story. I get asked to go to schools a lot, or I used to. I mean, I haven't done that in a while, so it doesn't happen very often anymore. But it used to be what I did for 20 years or so, 25 years, traveling around the country, going to schools, camps, hospitals with stories and music and such. And I got asked to go to this middle school out in Louisiana. Got invited to go out there with the Arts Council of Shreveport. And you can tell a lot about a school by the principal. Or sometimes you can tell a lot about the principal by the school, depending on who you meet first. It's an interesting dynamic. And so I got invited, and I didn't get a chance to meet the principal. I wasn't welcomed by the principal. I was welcomed by one of the librarians and then taken to the gym, which is a nasty place to try to tell stories with 500 kids in front of you. But I was taken to the gym. They sat in the bleachers, and I was ready to engage. And the principal came out and introduced me. Now, we don't do this very often, and we're doing this because we're taking a chance that you're going to behave yourselves. Now, if you don't behave yourselves, I'll come right out and stop it right there. I don't want to see any talking. I want you to sit motionless and to pay attention. I have no idea what he's going to do. I don't know if he's any good or not. But he's going to be talking, and you're going to be listening, and I'm going to be watching. Let's welcome Mr. Tom McDermott. So that's how I got introduced. And I came out, and it's not the worst introduction I've ever had, but it was up there. And I got started into telling a story. And one of my favorite crowds is the middle school, intermediate middle school, up to 7th grade. I really enjoy that. I think I sort of resonate with that age level. And as I was getting into the story, I couldn't help but notice a crowd in the back of about 10 or 15 kids were just kind of nudging each other and looking past me off in the distance. And I looked back, and I saw that what they saw was a bat flying around. And it was up in the rafters and coming down and up and coming down. And I said, and I interjected in the midst of the story, I see the bat. We'll continue with the story. I think the bat will be fine. And I continued in the story. And seemed like I had them at that point. And so as we were listening, I noticed one child in the middle look off to his right, and then another youth look off to his right. And then I looked off out of the corner of my eye, and I saw the principal come out at the back of the gym with a large broom. And he was walking across behind me as I was telling the story, waiting for the bat to come low enough so that he could whack it and slap it down to the ground, which is what he did as I was trying to tell the story. And in the midst of the story, you hear a bunch of the girls going, ooh, because he hit the bat and it fell to the floor. And I thought, that's fine. That's the end of it. But then he proceeded to sweep that bat all the way back across the floor, which took about 10 minutes. I finally stopped in the middle of my story, and I said, this is more interesting than me. And I sat down, and we watched as he finished it, and he said, sorry, just had to take care of this, and then went on off, and I had about 30 minutes left in my hour session and finished as best as I could, kind of limped my way out of there. You can tell a school by its principal. You can tell the principal by the school you often walk into. You see the kids engaged with one another. You see the kids working cooperatively with one another. You know something at the top is happening. You see teachers smiling and engaged, non-judgmental. You know something's happened. You see teachers being judgmental and critical and harsh and kind of linear about things. And you know what the principal's probably like. You can tell a lot about the tree by the fruit. You can tell a lot about the fruit by the tree. One of the things that I think it's interesting for us as people of faith, and whether we call ourselves Christians or of a Christian persuasion, we have this idea of God at the heart of all things. And it's a real challenge for us, I think, to realize that in here, we try to think of God more connectively. In fact, if I was going to tell you my definition of God, I'm going to bring it up right here. Well, I thought I was. My idea of what God is what connects us. The very ground of our being, the ground of our reality, it's what connects us. It's what I can grasp hold of. It's how I relate to life and how life relates to me. It's how I participate in life in a way that creates more healing and more wholeness and more opportunity for that to happen. And it's reflecting upon the teaching of Jesus, which was all about basically two things. Well, three things, I suppose. The most important two, he said, was loving your neighbor and loving God. So for me, the three things would be, he said loving your neighbor as yourself, so the three things would be loving yourself, loving your neighbor, loving God. But I see God as the very ground of our being. How do we love that? How do we participate in that? And this passage to me gives me an interesting metaphor for thinking about how to understand faith and spirituality in the 21st century, which is to pay attention to how we are connected with one another. And it's a real challenge in our culture because in the West, we are raised up very individual. We're raised up with a very precise kind of individualism that sort of, even as a small child, we already are sort of thinking about competition. What will we be? How are we going to make it? And our parents are already encouraging us to kind of think about what we're going to be when we grow up. We grow up with this idea of sort of making something of ourselves. And it's a challenge to try to see that we are part of something larger. It's just a challenge for us, I think, in the West. And yet that's what I see here in these texts. And in the proverb which says, pay attention to your heart, be mindful of your heart, because that's where life begins. Again, if you think in terms of the ground of our being and our connectivity, what does that really mean? Because when I think about where is your heart right now, you might say, well, I'm feeling kind of sad, or I'm feeling kind of lonely, or I'm feeling kind of anxious. We sort of think of our heart as the seat of where we have feelings and emotions, and that's true. And feelings and emotions are, of course, important. We talked about what it means to be human. But here's the important thing about thinking about what our heart is saying to us. Our feelings may be real, but they're not always fact, right? You know what I'm saying, what I'm talking about? We sometimes feel certain ways about things, but it's not always fact. In fact, it tends to be more about what we're related to subconsciously and unconsciously than what we're related to consciously. The whole variety of our experiences up to this point have conspired unconsciously to tell us who we are. And we've adopted those stories and those narratives, and those are at the base of our heart, oftentimes at the heart of our emotions. So when the text says, be mindful of your heart because that's where life begins, we're not talking, it's not talking about, gut feelings. It's talking about how are we connected to life? How are we connected to the holy? The Old Testament had an idea that the holy was all things, which is why a burning bush could suddenly crop up and Moses had to take his shoes off. There was this idea that kadosh was this holiness that's everywhere. It's all things. And once you start to recognize that, you can't escape God. But of course, a 3rd century BC or a 2nd century BC or a 1st century BC or even a 4th century after Christ, those notions of God are quite different because the notions of reality were quite different. In the 21st century, when we think about God as something more mysterious, something more unknown, we think about how did Jesus teach us to participate in whatever that reality is. And my temptation would be to sort of go for that personal Jesus, because I'm an individual. And when I have pain, and I want somebody to fix it. And so I want a personal Jesus. I don't think Jesus ever taught that. I don't think he ever said, you and I are going to be, we're going to be besties. And I'm going to always be there for you and do whatever. Now, we've heard that. We've all grown up with these narratives. But I don't think that's really what this is saying. Because Jesus was never about the individual. He was always about the community. He was always about justice. He was always about compassion. He was always about mercy. He was always about inclusiveness. He was always about the kingdom. That was what he was about, the kingdom. They called it kingdom then. It was more an empire orientation, but we call it kingdom. It's the interrelationship of life itself. Be mindful of your heart, because that's where life begins. How are we interconnected with one another? I've been reading this book called The Book of Joy. Some of you have read it. It's by Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu have written it. They're going to talk about it more throughout the church as we get into Advent, and we talk about the season of joy as we go into Advent. But one of the things that I read in this book that just took me by surprise, I mean, we've often heard in here, I've often talked about Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist teacher, and his idea of interbeing and the interrelationship of all things and the mindfulness that we fail sometimes very often to bring towards this connectivity. But they told a story in here about a monk, a Tibetan monk, who was at the Chinese gulag, and he was in captivity for 18 years during and after the war. And after he was released, he told an interviewer that his most desperate anxiety was that his life was threatened. He said, every day my life was in threat. I was in threat of losing it. And the man said, you mean they were cruel and that you were afraid they were going to kill you? And he said, no. He said, that's not what I was afraid of. I was afraid I was not going to be able to continue to love my enemy. Because as soon as I stop loving my enemy, I lose my connection to humanity. That's a hard thing. That's a hard thing to begin to think about what it means to be connected to the ground of our being. Because it means seeing something wider than us. Angela Kyoto Williams, who's a priest, a Buddhist, she's the first and only one of two African-American Zen Buddhists, and she has this wonderful teaching. She was on Krista Tippett the other day, and she says, if you think about what love is, it's space. Well, in Christian theology, we talk about that as mercy. Mercy gives others space to be who they are because it believes in who they are. It believes that they too are part of the ground of being, even if they don't see it, even if they're acting out of anxieties, out of those stories that they have grown up with, those narratives. Even if they're acting out of that, they too belong to that connectivity. They too are part of the tree. And so mercy says, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to extend an open space for you to be who you are, even if you don't see the truth of who you can be yet. Even if that means it's hurting me, right? I'm afraid of losing my humanity and not being able to love my oppressor. And Kyoto Williams, what she said is that's what love is. It's that space. And she says, and it's hard because I'm talking about giving that space to my own white oppressors. I'm talking about giving that space to the history of my ancestors and their oppression. And in order to see humanity become something else, it can't be transformed until I'm transformed. We can't be part of that transformation of the world until we're transformed, until we allow that space for our own stories. So I'm thinking about All Saints, and I'm thinking about this thing that I read recently called the 200-year present. Some of you might know about this. And we can do this very quickly. We can do this little exercise very quickly. I want you to think of, and you can, well, first of all, I'll say what to do, and then I'll qualify that. But I want you to think of the oldest member of your family's history that you had contact with, that you touched. They may have held you, you may have seen them, you may have known them. It might be a great-great-grandmother, a great-great-aunt, a great-great-uncle. Think back to that generation, your parents, their parents' parents. If you're adopted, this is more difficult. I recognize that. This is more challenging. But what I want you to do is to imagine, and even if it's a difficult story that you know about, I want you to imagine past that story, to simply think about generations, and think back where a parent would have been born, and then the grandparent, what year that would have been, and then the great-grandparent if you had been just an infant and touched by that great-grandparent. So we're talking sometime in the 1860s, 1870s, maybe 1880s. And then you go back forward and you look at your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. And if you don't have them, you imagine what that might be if you live so long to see great-grandchildren. And now how long will they live? And we're talking 2100, maybe 2110, 1870 or 80s to 2110. The 200-year present is a mindfulness that realizes life is always bigger than our limitations and ego and selfishness. It's always bigger. It's always changing. It's always progressing. It's always moving. How do you participate here and now to be a part of that kind of vision, right? How did they participate in the past to be a part of this? And maybe they didn't, but that's the beauty of imagination. Is you get to change that. You get to participate in transforming that. Next week, I want to talk about prophetic imagination, and we're going to talk about how we transform our lives, our histories, and our futures with prophetic imagination. But for now, I want you to think just about this 200-year present, because it is so much bigger than who we are. What will life be like? Not just for humanity. What will the earth be like? Will the earth be here in 2110? Well, earth probably will. We may not be, but the earth will be. What will the earth be like in 20? What will the environment be? Who will have beachfront property at that point? Right? You hear all those stories. What will life be like? How can we participate now with a mindset that looks to the future? Because wherever we are always in this 200-year present. The Navajo called it the 7 generations decision. You always made a decision based on the generations before and the generations to come. How will my actions affect that? Last thing. You remember this story? I told it to you before a long time ago, so I'm just going to abbreviate it. The two farmers that were having a conflict with each other on either side of this property, sort of like a little kind of a crevice between their property, but they didn't have a fence, so their cattle, their livestock would wander back and forth, and after a while, they started mistrusting each other. This was my cattle, and why is he over there? And now I think you've stolen my cattle, and it just got mixed up, and who knows why? Maybe it's our individuality, but eventually they began to accuse one another. And those accusations got built into fear and into cortisol and the brain stuff that we talked about. And before you know it, they didn't want to have anything to do with each other. Right? You know people? We know people, yeah. And so they said, we're going to get a fence built. And so they went into town and found a carpenter. And so the carpenter comes out and he's told, I want you to build a fence. The one farmer, John, on one side of it, he says, we're going to build a fence. I don't want that guy over there, George, to see anything I'm going to do. He's not going to be able to get across. And my cattle won't get over there. His won't get over here. Just put up a fence. And so the guy said, okay. And they showed him where the materials were. He went on into town, was gone for the day. But when he came back, you know what happened, if you remember the story. When he got back, there wasn't a fence. There was a bridge. It was a bridge over that little crevice in the property. And so when he got there, he was furious that he wasn't, that they didn't go, he didn't respond, he didn't follow his orders. But instead, just as he was about to lose it, he saw George coming across that pasture up onto the bridge. And he had this demeanor that just looked humble about him. And so when John walks up to George, and George says, I can't believe you did this, but I appreciated it. I saw what you were doing, and I realized we can't stay enemies. We just can't. And once I saw you built a bridge, I thought, I got to respond. And so he came across, they shook hands, and then they became friends forever. Shared, didn't matter, right? We define ourselves by our individuality, but we live in a connectivity. And the only way to find these redemptive moments is to remember to pay attention to your heart, to find time to create space to allow others to be who they are, and then to look for materials to build a bridge. And if you've experienced that redemptive moment, you know that connectivity is far more powerful than all of the anger and resentment prior to that. Amen. So here's what we're going to do. The band's up there looking at me like, Tom, you're next. We're going to participate in communion, and we're going to have 3 stations, so it'll go pretty quickly. We'll have a station here. We'll have a station over here. We'll have a station over here, and we'll have one in the back. And then you just kind of come around, find your way, and make your way back to your seat. But here's what I want to say real quickly. We do communion in here, and it's open for everyone, of course, to participate in. There's no limitation on who or who can't. But I also want you to understand we do communion a little differently, because we do it less about a sacrifice made for our sins, and we do it more about a model of someone who modeled what it means to build bridges across divides, who modeled what it means to participate in life and connectivity as opposed to individuality and ego. We don't do communion for our salvation. We participate in the brokenness of the bread and in the cup and recognize all of its confusing elements and its mystery, and then we offer that mystery to others, and we participate in that brokenness with others. It's a chance for us to realize and to remember we are a part of something larger. We are a part of something so much larger. So we invite you to come and to participate with us, with one another, as we do that. And then I said, Sharm will be over here, I will be over here, and then John will be back here. And so come as the band is playing music. We invite you to participate in this brokenness with us.